On a Wednesday morning in the third week of November 2003, Lorette Gagnon stood at the edge of her driveway on Rang Saint-Pierre outside Sainte-Cécile-de-Witton and watched the last truck from the co-op disappear around the bend in the road without stopping. The driver had slowed near her gate, the way he always did, and then kept going. She had been waiting since 7 in the morning. It was now past 9, and the temperature had dropped to -14, and she understood from the way the truck hadn't stopped that the decision had already been made somewhere without her. That was the fall of 2003, and if you know anything about what was happening to small dairy operations in the eastern townships of Quebec in those years, you already know the shape of what Lorette was facing. The consolidation had been coming for a decade, quiet and patient, the way a change in weather comes across flat ground. The big operations near Sherbrooke and Drummondville were growing. The quota system was shifting weight toward size. The processing contracts that had kept small producers viable through the 90s were being renegotiated, not in bad faith, but in the language of scale and efficiency, which is a language that does not have a good word for a 160-acre farm run by one woman with 2 hired hands and a herd of 53 Holsteins. Lorette Gagnon was 51 years old that November, and she had been in dairy her entire working life. She had grown up on the farm. She had learned the herd from her father the way you learn a language when you are young, not as a series of rules, but as a way of understanding the world. She could read a cow's condition from across the yard. She knew which animals ran warm in winter and which ones needed watching in July. She had taken over from her parents in 1989 when her father's back gave out, and her mother decided that 40 years of 4:30 mornings was enough for anyone, and she had run the operation alone since her husband Etienne left in 1994, which was a thing she did not talk about except to say that some men are built for farm life and some men discover too late that they are not. She had 2 men who worked for her, Donnet Wellet, who was 63 and had been on the farm longer than Lorette had been running it, and a younger man named Stephen who had come to her 3 years ago looking for work and turned out to be the kind of person who learns quickly and doesn't need to be asked twice. She also had her daughter Brigitte, who was 26 and living in Quebec City and working for a government ministry and calling every Sunday without fail. Let me tell you what the co-op decision actually meant, because it matters to understand what Lorette was looking at that November morning. The co-op had decided to consolidate pickup routes. The logic was fuel costs and driver hours and the per-liter economics of running a truck to a farm that produced what Lorette produced versus the economics of running that same truck to an operation 10 times her size. The decision was not personal. The co-op representative had told her so in September in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes in a voice that was genuinely apologetic and completely firm. They would honor her contract through the end of the year. After January 1st, she would need to make other arrangements. Other arrangements in practice meant finding a processor willing to take her volume, which was not large enough to be interesting to anyone with a modern facility and a preference for predictability, or it meant selling the quota and the herd and deciding what to do with 160 acres of Quebec farmland and a barn that her grandfather had built in 1931. She had made calls. She had driven to Sherbrooke twice and to Thetford mines once, and spoken to people at 2 processing operations and a small cheese producer who had been politely interested and then gone quiet. She had talked to the Federation. She had talked to her accountant, a careful man named Roland Bedard, who had been doing her books for 15 years and who laid out the numbers for her in a way that was honest and not unkind, and that pointed in one direction. She had 60 days to find a buyer for her milk or to begin the process of winding down. Donnet knew. She had told him in October, sitting at her kitchen table with the co-op letter between them. He had looked at the letter for a long time and then looked at her and said nothing, which was how Donnet communicated most things that mattered to him. Stephen did not know yet. She was waiting until she had something real to tell him. Let me tell you about what happened in the first week of December, because this is where the story changes direction, though from the outside it doesn't look like it's changing yet. From the outside it still looks like a woman running out of time. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon from a woman Lorette had met once at a Federation meeting 3 years earlier. Her name was Eveline Chartrand, and she ran a small artisan cheese operation in the Bois-Francs region, east of Victoriaville, out of a farmstead that had been in her family since the 1880s. Eveline made 4 kinds of aged cheese. She sold them to restaurants in Montreal and at farmers markets in the region, and through a small network of specialty food shops that had been growing steadily since 2000, on the back of a general interest in Quebec artisan products that nobody in the mainstream dairy industry had taken seriously until it was already a real thing. Eveline had heard about Lorette's situation through the Federation Network, which in rural Quebec operates the way it has always operated, which is to say that information moves between people who know each other through marriages and funerals and hockey tournaments and shared equipment and 30 years of buying from the same feed supplier. Eveline said she had been looking for a consistent source of milk from a herd with a specific profile. Her cheeses required a fat content and a bacterial complexity that she could not get reliably from the aggregated supply she was currently using. She needed a single herd source. She needed 50 to 60 animals. She needed someone who ran their herd a particular way. She asked Lorette 3 questions about her operation. Lorette answered all 3. There was a pause, and then Eveline said, "I'd like to come and see the farm." She came the following Saturday. She arrived at 8 in the morning, which told Lorette something about the kind of person she was, because people who make dairy products and show up at 8 in the morning at a working farm in December are people who understand what 8 in the morning at a working farm in December means. She walked the barn with Lorette for an hour and a half. She looked at the herd. She asked about feed and pasture, and the water source and the cleaning protocols, and the way Lorette managed mastitis. She asked questions that were specific in the way that only someone who actually understands the thing they're asking about can be specific. At the end of the barn walk, she stood near the door and looked at the herd for a moment and said, "How long have you been running them this way?" Lorette said, 20 years since I took over from my father. Eveline nodded slowly. She said, "This is what I've been looking for 3 years." Let me tell you what Eveline meant by that, because it is the center of this story, and it is the thing that took Lorette herself some time to understand clearly. What Eveline was looking for was not unusual in its ingredients. She needed milk with high fat, sufficient protein, and a microbial profile that would support the specific cultures she used in her aging process. These things are not secret. Any cheesemaker working at her level knows what she needs. What was unusual was finding them together in a single operation that was managed consistently over time by someone who understood their herd well enough to maintain that consistency through seasons and illness and the ordinary variables of farm life. Industrial supply is large and reliable and almost entirely wrong for what Eveline was making. The aggregated milk that came through standard channels had been optimized for volume and safety and shelf stability, which are the right things to optimize for most purposes and the wrong things to optimize for aged artisan cheese, which requires a living complexity in the milk that aggregation and standardization tend to flatten out. Lorette had been running her herd the way her father had taught her and his mother had taught him. Pasture in season managed carefully, feed that she had sourced from the same supplier in Lac-Mégantic for 16 years. A low-stress handling approach that Donut implemented with a consistency that bordered on ritual. A milking protocol that had not changed in the time Lorette had been running the operation because she saw no reason to change something that was working. She had not been doing these things because she was trying to produce milk for artisan cheese. She had been doing them because she was running a dairy operation the way she believed a dairy operation should be run, and the belief came not from any industry publication or agricultural extension service, but from her father and from her own 40 years of paying attention to the same animals on the same land. What she had, it turned out, was exactly what a growing sector of the Quebec food economy had been trying to find for the better part of a decade. She had just not known that anyone was looking. Roland Bedard drew up the supply contract in January. It was unlike any contract Lorette had signed before, not a volume commitment priced to the standard formula, but an arrangement built around quality specifications and consistency, and a premium that reflected what Eveline's cheeses actually required, and what Lorette's operation actually provided. The premium was significant. It was the difference between a farm that was running out of time and a farm that was not. Donut heard the terms at the kitchen table on the evening the contract was signed, and he looked at the paper for a long time and then looked at Lorette and said, in the particular way Donut had of saying things he considered important, "It's about time." Stéphane did not say anything. He read the contract twice and then went back out to the barn to finish the evening milking, and when he came back in his face had the look of someone who has just been told that the ground under his feet is solid after all. Brigitte called on Sunday as she always did, and Lorette told her. Brigitte was quiet for a moment and then said, "My man, I've been scared for you since September." Lorette said she knew. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 2 years, because the winter of 2003 into 2004 was not the end of the difficulty. It was the beginning of something different, which is not the same thing as easy. The arrangement with Eveline worked. The milk that came from Lorette's herd produced the bacterial profile Eveline needed with a consistency that surprised even Eveline, who had expected some variation as she learned the supply. There was variation, season to season, the way there is variation in any living system, but it stayed within the range that her cultures could work with, and after the first full cycle of aging she called Lorette and said that 2 of her cheeses were producing a flavor complexity she had not been able to achieve reliably before. Word moved the way word moves in the artisan food world of Quebec, which has its own networks and its own logic, not unlike the way word moved among farmers in Shelby County, Iowa in 1987. Slowly, specifically, through people who know each other and trust each other's judgment about things that matter. By the end of 2004, Eveline had introduced Lorette to 2 other small cheese producers who were looking for reliable single-herd sources. By the end of 2005, Lorette had supply agreements with 3 artisan operations and was running her herd at a margin she had not seen since the late 90s. She did not expand the herd. This was a decision people asked her about, because the logic of the situation seemed to suggest that more animals would mean more income. Lorette understood the logic and rejected it. She had 53 animals, now 57, and she understood them. She understood the land they grazed and the way it needed to be managed, and the point at which scale would begin to change the very thing that made her milk worth what it was worth. She kept the herd where she could keep her hands on it. She kept Donat on until he retired in 2007, and she replaced him with a young woman from St. Ludger named Annette, who had grown up on a beef operation and learned dairy from the ground up in Lorette's barn with a speed that reminded Lorette of herself at that age. She did not advertise. The supply relationships came through the network that Eveline had introduced her to, and through her own reputation in that network, which grew the way reputations grow in small industries where quality is the only thing that matters, and everyone eventually knows everyone else's results. In 2008, a food writer from a Montreal magazine drove out to Sainte-Cécile-de-Whitton to write about one of Eveline's cheeses and ended up spending 3 hours in Lorette's barn asking questions about the herd. The article appeared that autumn and mentioned Lorette's farm by name and described her approach in a way that was accurate and not oversimplified, which Lorette appreciated. She received 11 inquiries from that article. She could accommodate 2 of them. She told the others, honestly, that she did not have the capacity, and she gave 3 of them Eveline's number because she trusted Eveline to explain what they actually needed and why they might not find it easily elsewhere. Roland Bedard, who was by then thinking about retirement and had handed most of his clients to a younger accountant in Lac-Mégantic, looked at Lorette's books in the fall of 2008 and said, with the particular understatement of a man who had spent 30 years reading farm finances, "You've turned this around." Lorette said, "I didn't turn it around. I just kept doing what I was already doing." Roland looked at her over his glasses and said, "That's what turning it around looks like sometimes." Let me tell you about what Lorette told Brigitte, because Brigitte is the one who eventually came back to the farm, and Brigitte is the one who has the photograph on the wall of the office now, and the conversation matters to understanding why. Brigitte Gagnon left the government ministry in 2011. She was 34 years old, and she had spent 8 years in Quebec City working on agricultural policy files, which meant she understood the industry in a structural way that her mother had never needed to, and her mother understood the industry in a specific and embodied way that Brigitte had grown up adjacent to without fully inhabiting. She came back to the farm with the combination of knowledge that you get when those 2 kinds of understanding finally meet in the same person. What Lorette had told her, in pieces over the years and more directly in the conversation they had the winter after Brigitte came home, went roughly like this. She said the co-op had not been wrong about the economics of their route. She said the big processors had not been wrong about what their operations needed. She said that none of the people who had made decisions that nearly ended her farm had been operating in bad faith. They had been optimizing for what they were optimizing for, and what they were optimizing for was scale and standardization and the kind of reliability that comes from making many things similar. She said what she had was different from what they were looking for, and she had not known that someone else was looking for exactly what she had. She said the mistake, if there was one, was not that she had run her farm wrong. The mistake was nearly believing the people who told her that the way she ran her farm was worth nothing because it was not worth anything to them. She said, there are 2 kinds of value. There's the value that fits into the system that already exists, and there's the value that fits into a system that is just beginning to exist and that the people running the old system cannot see yet because they are standing inside it. Your job is to know which one you have and to hold on to it long enough for the second kind of system to find you. Brigitte was 35 when she heard this clearly enough to carry it. She has repeated it in various forms to various people in the years since. She repeated it last spring to a young farmer from the Beauce region who had driven out to Sainte-Cécile-de-Whitton with a problem that the standard agricultural networks could not solve, a specialty grain operation that could not find a processor aligned with what it was producing. She listened to his problem and then took him to the kitchen table and poured him coffee and told him the story of the winter of 2003 the way Lorette had told it to her. The young farmer from Beauce listened without interrupting, When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My grandfather told me something like that. He said, 'Hold what you know longer than is comfortable, because the world takes time to catch up to the right things.'" Brigitte nodded. She gave him 2 names in the artisan network that she thought might be relevant to his situation. He called her 6 weeks later to say that one of them had worked out. Lorette is 69 now. She does not milk in the mornings anymore. Which was a concession she made 3 years ago when her hands started telling her what her hands had been telling farmers in this part of Quebec for generations, which is that this work is real and the body remembers all of it. She walks the barn every morning. She checks the herd the way her father taught her, with her eyes and her hands and the accumulated attention of a lifetime on the same ground with the same animals. The herd is 61 now. Annette runs the daily operation with the same low-stress approach that Donnet established and Lorette maintained, and the milk that comes from those 61 animals goes to 4 artisan operations, 2 of which are making cheeses that have won recognition at competitions in France, which is a thing that Lorette finds quietly satisfying without making too much of it, because that is not the part of the story she thinks is important. The photograph on the wall of the farm office was taken in December of 2003, 2 weeks after Eveline Chartrand's first visit. It shows Lorette standing in the barn near the milking station, in her barn coat and her work boots, with her hand resting on the back of a Holstein named Mathilde, who was the lead cow of the herd for 11 years, and who died in 2009 at an age that Lorette's vet said was exceptional. Lorette is not smiling for the camera. She is looking at the cow the way a person looks at something they know very well and are not done knowing. People who come to the farm sometimes ask about the photograph. Brigitte tells them the story. She tells it the way Lorette told it to her, not as a story about a small farm beating a large industry, because that is not what it was. She tells it as a story about knowing what you have, about the difference between the value that a system can see and the value that a system cannot see yet, and about the discipline required to hold on to a thing long enough for that second kind of vision to arrive. The herd is in the barn now. Annette is doing the morning milking. The supply contracts are in the office, in a green folder that Brigitte updates each season. The artisan network that began with one phone call from Eveline Chartrand in the first week of December 2003 has grown into something that connects dozens of small producers across Quebec with the operations that need exactly what they produce. Lorette's farm is still on Rang Saint-Pierre, outside Saint-Cécile-de-Witten, on the same 160 acres her grandfather cleared. The barn her grandfather built is still standing. The co-op truck that didn't stop in November of 2003 represents a company that has since restructured twice. And every few years when the standard channels fail someone with something real, Brigitte Gagnon's phone rings with the particular urgency of a person who has run out of the answers the system is offering, and is ready, finally, to ask whether someone knows of a different kind of answer. Lorette usually knows. She has been paying attention to the same ground for a long time, and in this part of Quebec, that is still worth something. I think about Lorette standing at the end of her driveway in November, watching that truck go past without stopping, and I think about how close it came. Not dramatically close, not the kind of close that makes a good movie, but the quiet, grinding kind of close, the kind where a person starts doing the math in their head, and the math keeps coming up the same way, and they have to decide whether to believe the math or to keep going anyway. What strikes me now, looking back at what happened on Rang Saint-Pierre, is that the thing that saved her was not luck. It was the consequence of decisions she had made long before anyone told her those decisions had value. She had run her herd carefully because she believed that was the right way to run a herd. She had sourced her feed from the same supplier for 16 years because consistency mattered to her and to the animals in her care. She had maintained Donnett's low-stress handling approach not because some industry study told her to, but because she had watched her father do it and understood, at a level below argument, that it was the honest way to treat a living thing. That's the part I keep coming back to. The integrity was there before anyone was paying for it. The knowledge was real before anyone recognized it. She was not performing a kind of farming that she thought the market might eventually reward. She was simply doing what she knew was right, with the full attention that right things deserve, for 20 years. And then the market caught up. I think that's the shape of most real things. The value is genuine long before it's visible. The people who hold on to what they know to be true, even when the system around them is saying that truth is worth nothing, are not being stubborn or naive. They are exercising a kind of intelligence that is harder than it looks, because it requires you to trust your own understanding of a thing more than you trust the signals coming from outside. Lorette knew her herd. She knew what the milk was. She knew what it took to produce it and why the way she produced it mattered. When the co-op told her the economics didn't work, she didn't stop knowing those things. She just had to hold them long enough for Eveline Chartrand to call. There is something in that story that I find genuinely demanding. Not comforting, demanding. Because it means the work comes first and the recognition comes when it comes, and the interval between them can be long and frightening and full of people who mean well and are telling you with complete sincerity that what you have is not worth what you think it is. Getting through that interval requires something more than patience. It requires a clear-eyed belief in your own judgment that is not arrogance. Lorette was not arrogant, she was precise, but is a decision to remain anchored to what you actually know rather than to what the current system can currently see. Brigitte understood this eventually. She came back to the farm with two kinds of knowing and spent years learning to hold them together. That's its own kind of courage, to return to a thing you partly left and to find that it is more than you understood when you were young enough not to need to understand it fully. The herd is still on Rang Saint-Pierre. The barn is still standing. The work continues because someone kept paying attention long enough for it to matter, and that, I think, is the only way anything real ever survives.